Good evening and a very, very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Rahel Yegi, and together with Robin Zelikatis, I'm the director of the Humanities and Social Change Center at Humboldt University, the institution responsible for the annual Benjamin Lectures. It is an honor to be your host for tonight. And I have to say, it's really amazing to see all of you, and there are still people waiting in the hallway, like 100 or so, but we can't actually admit everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to see this wonderful auditorium brimming with excitement. Actually, just last week, one of our Canadian colleagues, having seen the posters and advertisements all over Berlin, remarked that in Berlin, philosophical events are treated like pop concerts. And there has even been a debate on Twitter whether it is okay to treat Nancy as a rock star. So it might not be entirely true, even if it looks like she's a rock star when I look at all of you here. But I'm also quite confident when I predict that Nancy won't throw drumsticks into the crowd or go crowd surfing during the encore. But having said this, it's nonetheless really special to reach a public like this, situated at the intersection of academic and public life. And I will gladly admit that there are two very good reasons for being here tonight. The first, of course, is Nancy Fraser herself, our distinguished guest. It is certainly not an exaggeration to say that Nancy Fraser, who is a Henry and Louise Loeb Professor for Political Philosophy and Social Theory at the New School of Social Research in New York, author of canonical books like Unruly Practices, Scales of Justice, Redistribution or Recognition, Fortunes of Feminism, and, just in print, Cannibal Capitalism, just to name a few. Nancy Fraser is one of the most influential, most productive, and most interesting critical theorists of our time, which is why we invited her as our guest. She's a radical and a provocative thinker. When I say that she's a radical thinker, I mean this in two very important ways. On the one hand, she's a radical in the sense of political determination, a partisan thinker who sides with the idea of emancipation and the movements that struggle to bring them about. In this sense, she is an exemplary model for what Max Horkheimer understood as the task of critical theory, to serve as, I quote, the intellectual side of the historical process of emancipation. On the other hand, the very way she thinks is radical. Her thorough way of analyzing penetrates towards the roots of social conflicts and crises and shows the implications of political concepts and strategies. As a result, her work is thoughtful, deeply inspiring, and always a game changer in its field. Actually, it is hard to think of a single of her essays and books that has not made a difference. I don't know of anyone amongst us critical theorists who's better at balancing day-to-day political and strategical demands with the need for sincere theoretical engagement, who is more willing to take into account the theoretical needs of social movements, and who, as a result, is as much in confrontation with the multitude of contemporary emancipatory movements as she is solidaristic with them. She possesses the political acumen not only to identify the decisive social conflicts of our times, but she's careful and far-sighted enough in her analysis of the jumble of contemporary social struggles to also uncover unintended side effects and paradoxical alliances. Thus, she has been able to intervene critically in contemporary conflicts and social movements, making her one of the few philosophers whose influence is not limited to the academic world, but actually commands attention of political actors and social movements as well as the larger public. She is, one could say, the perfect critical companion of our times. The second reason now for being here, besides of Nancy Fraser as a person and as a thinker, the second reason, of course, is the topic that Nancy Fraser has chosen for these lectures, a topic that rightly cuts through current debates on identity politics and emancipatory strategies. Whereas in those debates, struggles against racism and sexism often appear to compete with or even oppose not only each other but also class struggle, Nancy will show that they share common ground and offer an understanding of the respective social struggles as struggles over, and this is her title, 3 phases of capitalist labor, thus uncovering the hidden ties among gender, race, and class. So if you have come here in order to find answers to everything you always wanted to know about gender, race, and class, and how those issues are connected, you are at the right place. One might allege that intersectionality has become a placeholder to mark the connections between the class, race, and gender lines of domination. What we will listen to over the next 3 days is a profound attempt to fill this gap and spell out these connections that have often remained merely asserted. The answer, so much can be revealed without giving too much away, is based in a theory of capitalist society. By identifying the driving mechanisms, Nancy will lay bare a deep structural dysfunction at the heart of our form of life, as she says. The crises that surround us and the respective struggles and social movements regarding race, class, and gender thus need to be connected because they already are connected in the deeper logics of the system. Today, crises might surround us, but neither the concrete analysis and exploration nor the solutions to our problems are self-evident once you leave the realm of, as Nancy would say, shallow moralizing or inconsequential outrage. We need to think big, Nancy likes to say. Now, the format of the Benjamin Chair and the Benjamin Lectures as a 3-part series of lectures is actually designed to make this possible, to enable us to think big and to arrive at the roots of the matter. It will allow her to develop a genuine plot with a sophisticated storyline and give her the opportunity for a deeper and extended engagement. This Benjamin Chair, named after the Berlin-born philosopher Walter Benjamin, is a temporary chair at the Center for Humanities and Social Change at Humboldt University zu Berlin, which was established in spring 2018 and is funded by the New Institute Foundation. Each year, we appoint an individual as Benjamin Chair, giving them the opportunity to develop and discuss with us our center's research theme, the crisis of capitalism and democracy, from a specific perspective. This work, those weeks of intensive discussion and engagement, public and less public events, then find their climax in the annual Walter Benjamin Lectures. And here we are. Tonight, Nancy Fraser will present the first of her 3 Benjamin Lectures, the lecture that establishes and lays out the problem: gender, race, and class through the lens of labor, a post-intersectional analysis of capitalist society. This lecture will be followed tomorrow by the next one, Labor's Twisted History, and then on June 15th, on Thursday, Class Beyond Class, toward a counter-hegemonic politics. Let me finish now by giving you some technical details and informations. Nancy Fraser is now going to present her lecture of roughly 1 hour, followed by a Q&A of roughly 30 minutes. Might be a bit less because we have started late. For the Q&A, there are 2 mics available in the aisle. If you want to ask a question, please queue in front of those mics. Also es gibt Mikrofone, die hier auf dem Gang stehen, und Sie können Fragen in Deutsch und in Englisch stellen, was mich auch zu dem Umstand bringt, ich habe es vorhin schon erwähnt, es gibt eine deutsche Übersetzung der gesamten Lectures und wie gesagt, auch die Fragen können auf Deutsch gestellt werden, die werden dann hier spontan übersetzt auf dem Podium. Please switch off your mobile phones. Bitte schalten Sie auch Ihre Handys aus. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but please keep on your mask or put on your mask. And if you want to do us a favor, please get tested every day before joining us here. We will do the same. Finally, talking about hidden ties and labor, thanks to everyone who has made this possible. Thanks to the amazing team of Center of Humanities and Social Change, whom you will get to know after the last lecture. Thanks to the New Institute Foundation, who has made our work possible. Thanks to Erik Mas, Anna Katzmann, Georg Dietz from the New Institute, who are here with us today. And a special thanks to Bernd Scherer, the director of the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, who has agreed to host us here in this really amazing place. I have to say, this is just one of the most beautiful buildings and auditoriums that I know, and Laura Mattes, who has been in charge of organizing this with us. So once again, I couldn't be more excited to welcome my esteemed colleague and dear friend, Nancy Fraser, for this occasion. We are tremendously happy and a little bit proud that she has accepted our invitation. Nancy, here you go.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that very beautiful, warm, and generous introduction. And let me add my thanks to the whole team, to everyone at the Center for the Humanities and Social Change, for the team here at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, and everyone else who has made this occasion possible. It's really a great pleasure to be here, to see so many friends and others, and to really unveil to you for the first time in public this project, which I'm only at the very beginning of. And I hope that I have made enough progress to have something interesting to say to you. Well, let me start by mentioning the obvious. The concept of labor is at the center of these lectures and of this project. Now, you might think that in proposing that focus, that I plan to return to a familiar and dépassé model of critical theory. If so, you would be mistaken. My goal here is to develop a new paradigm, capable of clarifying the most pressing problems, both practical and theoretical, that we face in the 21st century. Certainly, I will speak a lot about labor and about capitalism, but not in your grandfather's sense. On the contrary, my aim is to transform our understanding of both of those concepts, and through them, to rethink that famous triad, gender, race, and class. Over the course of these lectures, those last three terms will, I hope, be transformed as well. Class especially will emerge in a new guise. But perhaps you are wondering, why labor? Why make that old-fashioned concept the starting point for rethinking gender, race, and class? Isn't it tied to a perspective that prioritizes class over gender and race? And why does the triad need rethinking in the first place? Doesn't it represent a huge advance over the labor metaphysic and class reductionism that dominated social theory and political practice in the past? Doesn't a focus on labor risk losing more recent insights? Won't an approach that centers that concept reinstall the same discredited paradigm that feminists and anti-racists have worked so hard to dislodge? My answer on most counts is no, for reasons I'll soon explain. But let me tell you first how I came to the idea of this project. It began with a site diagnose. For several years now, I've been struck by the mismatch between the current scale of emancipatory political engagement on the one hand and the scale of the present crisis on the other. Emancipatory engagement is plentiful and potentially powerful, to be sure. It encompasses feminism, anti-racism, and anti-imperialism, as well as movements for labor and migrant rights, for social equality and livelihood security, for democracy and ecological sustainability, for peace and human rights. But these forces are fragmented and dispersed, disparate and uncoordinated. They neither coalesce around a shared project nor constitute a counter-hegemony. and so they are overmatched by the scale of the present crisis. It's a general crisis of our whole social order, in which multiple injustices and irrationalities converge and exacerbate one another. I need only mention planetary heating and global pandemics, ballooning precarity and inequality, declining living standards and shrunken social provision, forced migration, and racialized and sexualized violence, authoritarianism and persecutory scapegoating, de-democratization and militarization, and now, right on our doorstep, war. Where is the emancipatory coalition that offers a credible response to this nexus of horribles? Where is the visionary breadth and practical heft that embodies a genuine alternative to the system that generates them? Where is the project that could go toe-to-toe against the powers that be, against corporate neoliberalism on the one hand and reactionary populism on the other? If this diagnosis is grim, I am not alone in subscribing to it. On the contrary, many social justice activists and thinkers have grown dissatisfied with single-issue, identity-siloed politics. Appreciating the need for greater coordination, they are now seeking larger frameworks that can connect the dispersed struggles of multiple movements, political organizations, and labor unions. The paradigm of intersectionality, hugely popular among feminists and anti-racists and others, is one important marker of this aspiration. Others include the emergence or reemergence of social reproduction feminism, racial capitalism theory, eco-Marxism, and democratic socialism. All these and more betoken a growing desire for integrative thinking and practice. These lectures aim to advance that integrative project, although by a different route. Combining social theorizing with historical and political reflection, I shall offer an account of capitalist society as the common matrix that generates the social divisions of gender, race, and class, as well as their intersections. I shall trace that generative process through the lens of labor, broadly conceived. Deviating from received understandings, I'll argue that capitalist society relies on three types of work, not just exploited labor, performed by free workers in exchange for wages in for-profit enterprises, but also expropriated labor, unfree or semi-dependent, coercively extracted from racialized populations subjected through conquest or debt. And finally, domesticated labor, also known as care work and social reproduction, chronically undervalued, often invisible, and constitutively gendered. By mapping the entwinement in capitalist society of these three faces of labor, as I'm calling them, these lectures will try to uncover the hidden ties between gender, race, and class, and with them, I hope, a possible path to more coordinated emancipatory struggle. Now, my argument will unfold over 3 days and in 3 steps, which complement and reinforce one another. In tonight's lecture, I'll make the case on the structural level, sketching an expanded view of capitalism as something larger than an economy. I'll argue that its operation depends, for internal systemic reasons, on all 3 faces of labor working together. Their imbrication, I'll show, forms the triad's structural basis and undergirds the intersections of gender, race, and class. In tomorrow's lecture, I'll turn to the plane of history, tracing the shifting relations among labor's three phases over several phases of capitalist development. I'll specify for each phase who performs each form of work, who is recognized as a worker, and of course, who is not. I'll also track the overlaps and divisions among three corresponding social movements and lines of struggle: trade unionism, feminism, and anti-racism/anti-imperialism. My third lecture will probe the implications for contemporary politics. Although their work is functionally integrated, the three types of workers I'll be discussing remain politically divided according to the terms of the triad gender, race, and class. On Thursday, in the final lecture, I'll examine some strategies for overcoming those political separations in the hope of scaling up emancipatory engagement. So that's the overall plan for the 3 nights. Okay, I begin today with W.E.B. Du Bois, who provided the inspiration for this line of thought. And I have to say that I'm especially pleased to acknowledge that here. Du Bois, you may know, had important connections to Berlin and to Humboldt University, where he studied from 1892 to 1894, when it was still called Friedrich Wilhelms Universität. Although long neglected, those ties are now marked by a plaque in the main building of the university and will be celebrated, as it turns out, very soon on July 1st at the ceremonial unveiling of the W.E.B. Du Bois Memorial. And that's the first such honor accorded by Humboldt to a person of color and/or to a former student. In that sense, the timing of these lectures could not be better. That said, my interest in Du Bois is not ceremonial, but substantive. His stay in Berlin was formative for his overall development and for the aspects of it that inspire me here. It was at Humboldt that he first encountered sociology and social theory, disciplines that he went on to integrate with a historical perspective he acquired at Harvard and with the political orientation he developed by living while Black in the United States. This rich combination of social theory, history, and politics is on brilliant display in the work that first led me to the idea of 3 faces of labor. And that is his masterpiece, Black Reconstruction, published in 1935, which offered a major new interpretation of 19th century American history and of global capitalism more broadly, an interpretation centered on labor. Now, the book covers the period from 1860 through 1880. For those who are not Americanists, that's the period that includes the Civil War and formal abolition of slavery. It also includes post-war Reconstruction, whose radical wing aimed to transform Southern society in a way that would make emancipation a reality, not just a legal proclamation. And it includes, finally, what Du Bois called the counter-revolution of property, which reestablished Black subservience and white property rule. Now, in Du Bois's view, this period was a major historical turning point in which fundamental questions about the country's future, and by extension, the future of capitalism, were up for grabs. Would the outcome be plutocracy or what he called an abolition democracy, one based on labor as opposed to property? Du Bois thought that what he called Black Reconstruction, or radical Reconstruction, prefigured the second possibility by inventing a new use for state power. That use was to elevate and empower workers, both Black and white. Its suppression was plainly catastrophic for the freed men and freed women who were returned to a state close to bondage. But it also harmed poor and working class whites who lost the chance to improve their economic condition and to amplify their political voice. Plutocracy, Du Bois claimed, had triumphed at least for a while. Now, this narrative derives its political pathos from this intimation that Du Bois had of what might have been. But its analytic power comes from his conception of labor. In his view, the question of slavery was a question of labor, and anti-slavery was at bottom a labor movement aimed at emancipating unfree workers, not simply by legal proclamation, but also by transforming the property system and power relations that governed their work. For Du Bois, then, enslaved Black labor belonged to the same conceptual and political universe as free white labor, and the radical wings of anti-slavery and Reconstruction belonged to the same conceptual universe as trade unionism and socialism. In reality, Du Bois concluded the United States had two labor movements, separated by color and status. Had those movements recognized one another and joined forces, they might have changed the course of US history and that of global capitalism more broadly. Now, if that sounds strange at first hearing, the view of abolition and Reconstruction as centrally focused on labor has real historical plausibility and real continuing promise, not least because it broadens our view of what counts as labor and as a labor movement. So too does the image of two labor movements failing to recognize one another. What was missed, Du Bois suggests, was the possibility of an inclusive pro-working class front. Appreciating that labor assumes more than one form in capitalist society, such a front would have to recognize and embrace more than one labor movement. Failing that, it would lack the political heft and breadth of vision needed to defeat plutocracy and expand democracy. Now, what is crucial for my purposes here is the idea of more than one kind of labor, more than one kind of labor movement. As I read him, Du Bois was not seeking to homogenize labor, not to dissolve its internal differentiations into an abstract universal. Rather, he understood free and enslaved labor as distinct but structurally imbricated aspects of a single social system. Enslaved Black workers, Du Bois explained, were among what he called the founding stones of a new, rapidly developing system of industrial capitalism. Producing cotton for mills throughout the North Atlantic, these workers, as he called them, literally kept those enterprises humming, supplying raw materials for their free counterparts to work up as commodities and for the latter's employers to convert into profits. Black labor also served as the fulcrum for an extensive commercial nexus, linking the planters, merchants, bankers, insurers, and mill owners who divided the spoils. Framing the whole process globally, Du Bois situated Southern slaves within, quote, a dark and vast sea of human labor in China and India, the South Seas and all Africa, in the West Indies and Central America, and in the United States, that great majority of mankind on whose bent and broken backs rest today the founding stones of modern industry. That's the end of the quotation. Note, by the way, that word today, rest today. He's writing this in 1935 or just before 35, and that's a point I will certainly return to later. In any case, this remarkable claim cries to be read out alongside Karl Marx's identification of the so-called doubly free proletariat as the true creators of industrialism's marvels and as the system's eventual gravediggers. Where Marx gave pride of place to free but propertyless labor, forcibly separated from the means of subsistence and production, and compelled to sell their labor power in exchange for wages, Du Bois foregrounds the unfree workers whose labor power is not theirs to sell, but the property of others to command by the lash. And calling them founding stones of the world capitalist system, the author of Black Reconstruction delves beneath Marx's, quote, hidden abode of factory production to an even more hidden realm on which the factory rests. It's the relation between those two realms, the factory and the plantation, that is all important. To call enslaved agricultural labor a founding stone of modern industry is to say that Black expropriation undergirds white exploitation, that the two processes are inextricably imbricated, that the fates of the two groups of workers are tied together, that neither can be emancipated without the other, that two labor movements must join forces to abolish the system that generates their perverse symbiosis. Du Bois here posits a structural division within the working class. Riven by what he calls a global color line, this class comprises, again, a dark and vast mass, unfree or dependent, and a smaller, whiter mass, doubly free in Marx's sense, meaning formally free but compelled to sell its labor power. Whereas the second group's struggles are viewed through the lens of class and labor and are often characterized as economic, those of the first group are parsed in terms of status and citizenship denied, that is, and are deemed political. For Du Bois, however, those categories, political versus economic, are problematic, uncritically reflecting the design of a system that requires both types of labor, that imbricates them with one another, and that profits from their conjunction while dividing them from one another. In fact, the division between free and unfree labor, in his view, is at once political and economic. The two groups of workers are distinguished both by the status of their persons and by the form and remuneration or lack thereof they receive for their work. And yet, the two groups of workers are mobilized in tandem by one and the same social system. It follows for Du Bois that neither labor movement can emancipate itself on its own. What is required, rather, is their cooperation in an inclusive pro-working class front that embraces the cause of both. Now, I'm going to say more in the final lecture on Thursday about that political takeaway, explaining why Du Bois thought that white workers had more to gain than to lose from such an alliance, and about why I think that remains the case today. But tonight's agenda is structural. Here, I want to revise, or rather extend, his central argument. I want to agree first with Du Bois that the abolition of slavery in the US and elsewhere did not put an end to unfree expropriated labor in the capitalist world system, To this day, bonded and dependent labor continues in various guises, which we will enumerate. And it is still strongly racially marked. In light of this persistence, I claim that it still makes sense to view the anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggles of our time, too, as unrecognized labor struggles, for reasons I'll soon explain. But I want first to raise a question, namely, why stop there? Why not view feminist movements, too, as unacknowledged struggles over work in systems built on a gender separation of paid productive labor and paid and unpaid care work? After all, isn't that division between productive and reproductive work just as integral to capitalist society as the one Du Bois identified between expropriated and exploited labor? And if struggles to abolish prisons and defund the police are at least in part labor struggles, as I believe they are, why not say the same about Me Too, whose chief objective, after all, is to rid the workplace of abuses of power in the form of sexual harassment and assault? Why not view campaigns for universal social provision, things like family leave, childcare, elder care, health care, housing, pensions, income support, and so on, as struggles to prioritize the nurture of people over the making of profit? And why not view campaigns for the rights of migrants and domestic workers, and for the unionization of nurses, health aides, teachers, office cleaners, cooks, servers, and laundry workers as struggles to revalue social reproductive labor and to empower those who perform it? Gender, I'm claiming, is the missing third in Black Reconstruction. As many Black feminists have noted, enslaved labor was not confined to the fields, but also included coerced breeding, which sustained what has been called the peculiar institution for half a century after the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed. When Du Bois's book is read from that vantage point, it virtually begs us to thematize social reproduction as a third face of capitalist labor. That work, too, was and still is a founding stone of the global capitalist system, supplying the owners with labor, both exploitable and expropriable. Extending Du Bois' argument, then, I propose to view capitalist societies as relying on three analytically distinct but mutually imbricated forms of labor: exploited, expropriated, and domesticated. Thus broadened, his perspective invites us to view the shifting relations among the three faces of labor as constituting the hidden ties among gender, race, and class in capitalist societies. Identifying labor as the lens that discloses those hidden ties, finally, I want to reformulate Du Bois's political point. Our current aim should be to grasp the relations among not two, but three labor movements, and to evaluate prospects for uniting them. Let me turn now to the concept of labor. As I will use the term here, labor is effortful social action aimed at meeting social needs. Now, that's a very, very general definition, and it requires an important caveat. Neither the needs that labor addresses nor the character of that labor that addresses them are given once and for all. Rather, both develop historically, along with the societies in which labor is situated and through which it acquires its specific forms. In historical societies, then, labor interacts with nature, including with human nature, changing the latter and being changed by it. In effect, our effort to meet our needs changes us and transforms our needs, while also altering society and non-human nature. Needs, labor, and nature develop together along with human society in human history. Defined this way, as effortful, need-satisfying social action that develops historically, labor encompasses quite a lot. It certainly includes efforts to provision human groups with food to eat, places to sleep, means to stay warm, and tools with which to effect all of that and more. Efforts that often result in the production of useful objects. But object-producing labor of this sort presupposes other types of effortful, need-oriented activity, including activity that maintains natural habitats and non-human creatures on the one hand, and sustains individual people and human communities on the other. Those efforts of maintenance, nurture, and replenishment also count as social labor, even when they do not produce useful objects. Every human society undertakes them in one way or another, along with the making of objects. In fact, it's hard to imagine how object-making labor could even exist without labor that sustains non-human nature and human beings. Those last forms of labor supply the condition that make the first form possible. No wonder, then, that many societies do not separate the various forms of social labor I've just enumerated. Far from segregating them in specially designated institutional spheres, they intermingle them freely in shared social spaces, as when peasant women take their babies into the field and suckle them while tending their crops. In many societies, too, all the various labors I listed are understood as necessary and worthy. All are treated as belonging to the same social universe, even when tasks are divided by sex or class. Capitalist societies are different, however. What counts as work in capitalism is employment. And that covers a relatively narrow subset of the broad class of needs-oriented, effortful activities. Splitting off what is called production from the social activities that make it possible, capitalist societies exclude the latter activity from the universe of recognized labor. The work of maintaining what I think of as the background, both material background, natural background, and social background, is sometimes called reproduction as distinct from production, a nomenclature that is worth interrogating. But whatever we call it, the work in question is socially necessary. In capitalist societies, however, it is largely disavowed and often unremunerated. Only under special circumstances, namely when they assume the guise of employment and are paid wages, do activities concerned with natural and social reproduction appear on the corporate and state account books that recognize labor. When not commodified, they do not count as work, even though they supply the necessary preconditions for those activities that do. Capitalist societies thus hive off one portion of social labor from the rest and install it in a dedicated realm where it is made to serve a special function, namely generating surplus value for the sake of capital accumulation. What counts in this system, accordingly, are activities that produce economic value, and that means commodity-producing waged labor under the aegis of for-profit firms. This labor has some definite historical characteristics. It is, as I already noted, doubly free in Marx's sense. Free first, because those who perform it have the status of unencumbered rights-bearing individuals not bound to any one master. They own their own labor power and are free to sell it to whomever they please, but also free in a second sense because the workers are propertyless. Having been dispossessed of land, tools, animals, and other forms of wealth, they lack the means of production, and they lack access to the means of subsistence. In the end, accordingly, they have no choice but to sell their embodied capacity to work to some capitalist or another. In Marx's view, moreover, these workers, as they are called, are exploited. They are paid only for their necessary labor time, meaning for the hours required to produce a sum of value equivalent to their costs of living. The value produced in the remainder of their working hours is surplus and accrues not to them, but to the capitalist. Because they are compensated only for the costs of their reproduction, they can neither save nor acquire capital. Thus, their labor has a Sisyphean quality. Exploited wage workers push a boulder up the hill day after day without ever getting anywhere, just to avoid getting crushed. Value-producing labor is thus no picnic. Doubly free and exploited, it is also often stultifying, repetitive, heteronymous, and precarious. No wonder, then, that officially recognized capitalist labor has been, and still is, a major site and stake of struggle in capitalist societies. Nevertheless, exploited labor is only the tip of the capitalist iceberg. Beneath it lie two other genres of labor. First, what I'm calling expropriated labor, which is close to what Du Bois called dark labor. And second, what I am calling domesticated labor, which is close to what many feminists now call care work. Expropriated and domesticated labor are both forms of shadow labor, intrinsic to capitalist society and entangled with exploited labor, but overshadowed by it, lost in the glare of the latter's presumed normativity. To say they lie beneath exploited labor is thus to say two things. First, that they are founding stones in Du Bois's sense, that is, necessary conditions for exploited labor, co-original with it, and indispensable elements of the larger societal complex in which exploited labor is constituted as profitable and productive. But also second, that their crucial role in that complex is systematically under-recognized and undervalued, if not wholly disavowed, by virtue of capitalism's inherent economism, by which I mean its systemically driven and deeply reductive equation of work with activity that advances capital accumulation by expanding value. My point, then, is that expropriated and domesticated labor are every bit as intrinsic to capitalist society as exploited labor. Taken together and along with it, they form three interlocking pillars of one social system. By calling them three faces of capitalist labor, I mean to say that they are analytically distinct but internally related and mutually imbricated. Each face of labor has its role to play in capitalist society, but the role of each is co-constituted in and through its relation to the others. And none can play its role without the others. Together, they form a nexus at the heart of capitalist society. This nexus powers capitalism's singular productivity and destructivity, while also inscribing gender, race, and class within it as deep-seated social differentiations and as sites and stakes of social struggle. Let me elaborate. Expropriated labor is unfree or dependent labor, unwaged or underwaged, coercively extracted from subjugated populations. In a sense, it's as old as the hills. We find it in one or another guise throughout human history, including in ancient empires and feudal societies, hence long before the advent of capitalism. That's doubtless why it has sometimes been considered residual, an archaic vestige of pre-capitalist society destined to fade away as capitalism matures. And yet it doesn't. Dependent, or underwaged labor is alive and well today in forms both old and new. We find it even now in prisons, brothels, sweatshops, plantations, slaughterhouses, favelas, and industries that employ migrants, especially migrants without papers. It has been said that behind Manchester stood Mississippi, meaning, as Du Bois explained, that slave labor supplied the cheap raw cotton that fed the iconic textile mills at the dawn of industrialization. But the same is true today. Behind Cupertino stands Kinshasa, where lithium for batteries and coltan for iPhones are mined on the cheap, at times by enslaved Congolese children. The question is why? Why does expropriated labor persist in a social system that prides itself on its modernity, one that claims a monopoly on technological advancement and efficiency on the one hand, and on liberal values and human freedom on the other? The reason is expropriated labor has a structural basis in capitalist society. Although it is usually seen as the antithesis of exploited labor, it is better understood as one of the latter's enabling conditions. The reason is in part economic. Expropriated labor is cheap. Extracted from subjugated populations who lack state protections and actionable rights, this labor is unregulated by contract or law. Sitting near the far end of the spectrum between doubly free and outright coerced, even when not literally enslaved, those who perform it cannot command a wage that covers their living costs. And that's a major difference from exploited labor, which, as I said, is paid, at least in theory, for its necessary labor time, meaning for its living costs. In expropriated labor, by contrast, capital does not even pay for that, helping itself to a productive input for whose reproduction it does not pay. Capital gets the latter below cost on the cheap. Now, from a strictly economic standpoint, expropriated labor is of great potential interest to capitalist firms. By definition, a system devoted to the limitless expansion and private appropriation of surplus value gives them a deep-seated interest in cheap inputs. Expropriation raises profits by lowering costs. That's the effect, obviously, when firms employ dependent labor directly in for-profit commodity production. But they needn't go so far as that to reap the benefits. They also profit by accessing cheap, non-human inputs, such as energy and raw materials, which were produced by unfree labor somewhere else. And they gain as well when the deployment of expropriated labor elsewhere makes available low-cost means of subsistence, such as food and textiles, which lowers living costs and enables them to pay lower wages to their own exploited workers. In other words, by expropriating labor from unfree or dependent subjects, capitalists can more profitably exploit doubly free workers. What was true in Du Bois's time remains true today. Behind Cupertino stands Kinshasa. Behind those who shop at Walmart stand those who sew in Dhaka. Those phrases suggest a further point. Expropriated labor is generally racialized. As Du Bois noted, the distinction between free and dependent labor corresponds roughly but unmistakably to the global color line, and that holds today as well. Who else are the expropriated in 2022? But again, that dark and vast sea of human labor on whose bent and broken backs rests modern industry, according to Du Bois again. This, too, is not accidental. The association of expropriation with racialization is also structurally grounded, but in a different way, which has as much to do with politics as economics. If, for the moment, we leave aside domesticated labor, which I haven't yet gotten to, we are led to view expropriated labor as Du Bois viewed it, namely, as occupying the bottom tier of a politically constituted status hierarchy within capitalism's producing classes. This view has considerable merit. As we saw, exploitable workers have the status of rights-bearing individuals and citizens entitled to state protection and able to sell their own labor power. By contrast, their expropriable counterparts are constituted as unfree dependent beings, stripped of political protection, rendered defenseless, and inherently violable. It thus appears that capitalist society creates two distinct categories of persons, one suitable for mere exploitation, the other destined for brute expropriation. This division forms the structural basis of racial cum imperial oppression. It is overwhelmingly racialized populations who are denied political protection in capitalist society and subject to repeated violations. We need only mention chattel slaves, colonized subjects, conquered natives, debt peons, illegals, convicted felons, racialized subjects of apartheid states and their dependents, migrants, all of whom are subject to expropriation, not just once, as were those who became citizen workers, but again and again. Now, what this shows is that the exploitation-expropriation division is both economic and political. Coinciding with the global color line, it inscribes race as a structural fault line in capitalist society, and thus implants within the latter a whole series of structural injustices: racial oppression, imperialism, old and new, indigenous dispossession, exclusion of asylum seekers, abuse of migrants, even genocide. The common thread here is political exposure, the incapacity to set limits and invoke protections. Exposure is, in my view, the deepest meaning of expropriability, the thing that sets it apart from exploitability. And it is expropriability, the condition of being defenseless and liable to violation, that constitutes the core of racial oppression. What distinguishes free subjects of exploitation from dependent subjects of expropriation is the mark of race as a sign of violability. Once racialized, moreover, expropriated labor is constituted as servile and menial, lower in status than exploited work. However bad the latter is, the former is, indeed must be, worse. Construed and constructed as degraded animal toil, it is, in effect, subwork, a term that signals the low status of those who perform it, the substandard treatment afforded them, and the subpar conditions of the work itself and of its surroundings. And yet, this expropriated labor of racialized others constitutes a necessary background condition for the exploited labor of capitalism's iconic workers. Now, this account of capitalism's exploitation and expropriation nexus is immensely clarifying and right as far as it goes. But it doesn't go far enough. To speak of a single two-tiered division within the system's producing classes misses a crucial point. Those two tiers depend on and are imbricated with a third. That third phase of capitalist labor I call domesticated, although I confess I have some misgivings about that term. I couldn't think of a better one. If anyone has an idea, I'm very interested. The problem is that domestication might suggest that the work I have in mind is performed exclusively within one's own private household and is unpaid. And that is not what I mean to suggest. Rather, I understand domesticated labor broadly to include people nurturing and community-sustaining work of many sorts, both unpaid and underpaid, and performed in a variety of different settings, from private homes, neighborhoods, and villages, to public agencies, civil society associations, and even nowadays in for-profit firms. In other words, domesticated here does not mean domestic. It does not indicate the social location or inherent quality of the work. Quite the contrary. To call this work domesticated is rather to say that it has been tamed, shaped by a historical process of constitution, which has made it shadow work, the devalorized other of productive labor. Now, to understand the full force of this claim, we need to contrast the general idea of need-oriented, effortful activity aimed at nurturing people and communities with the way that activity is constituted, indeed twisted, in capitalist societies. Sometimes called care, affective labor, or even subjectivization, this activity comprises provisioning, caregiving, and interaction that produces and sustains social bonds. In effect, it forms human subjects, sustaining them as natural beings and constituting them as social beings, forming their habitus and cultural ethos, as well as protecting and cleaning their bodies. The work of birthing and socializing the young is central to this process, as is caring for the old, maintaining living spaces, building communities, and sustaining the shared meanings, affective dispositions, and horizons of value that underpin social cooperation. By any non-perverse definition, all of this merits the title of social labor. Understood broadly in this way, social reproductive labor is essential to every society. In capitalist societies, however, it assumes another, more specific function: to produce and replenish the classes whose labor power capital exploits to obtain surplus value. Ironically, then, care work produces the labor that the system calls productive, but is itself deemed unproductive. Now, it's true, of course, that much, though not all, care work is located outside the value-accumulating circuits of the official economy. As I said, in homes and neighborhoods, civil society associations, and agencies of the state. It's also true that relatively little of it produces value in the capitalist sense, even when it is done for pay. But regardless of where it is performed and of whether or not it is paid, care work is necessary to capitalism's functioning. Neither the waged work that is deemed productive nor the surplus value extracted from it could exist in the absence of care work. It is only thanks to housework, child-rearing, schooling, affective care, and a host of related activities that capital can obtain a workforce suited in quality and in quantity to its requirements. Social reproduction is an indispensable precondition for economic production in capitalist societies. Yet capitalist societies have historically constituted this activity as non-work, splitting it off from properly economic activities that produce value. Set apart from exploited and expropriated work, social reproductive work is domesticated, feminized, and naturalized. Viewed as the simple expression of maternal feeling or feminine instinct, it is not counted as real social labor. Merely natural, so the story goes. Care work doesn't involve the sort of intelligence, creativity, or skill that has been developed historically through social practice. As a result, it too becomes cheap, treated by capital like a natural resource, simply there and available for the taking by firms who needn't bother to replenish what they take or repair what they damage. Capital, in a word, free rides on domesticated labor, paying as little as possible for it, if anything at all. Here, too, it obtains an essential condition for its self-expansion, be low cost, without having to pay for its reproduction. Now, in its cheapness, domesticated labor has something in common with expropriated labor, but the differences between the two types of shadow work make all the difference. Although both are externalized from the normative category of exploited labor, doubly free labor, one form is externalized through racialization, the other through processes of gendering. Care work has been put on a pedestal and sentimentalized, even as those who perform it are prevented from participating fully as peers in society. Subwork, by contrast, is bestialized and degraded, toil unbefitting a human being. The second is looked away from and kept at a distance, while the first is up close and personal, even at times idealized. Granted, neither group of shadow workers needs to be smart, creative, or skillful, but the traits desired in each are not the same. While care workers should be creatures of feeling, exquisitely sensitive to others' needs, subworkers should be thick-skinned, dumb beasts of burden who can take punches and endure pain. In effect, the first are hyper-affected, while the second must be affect-deprived. Thus, the workers are differently constructed in the two cases. They are not interchangeable, neither with each other nor with the mainstream of exploited workers. Those among them whom the system finds no use for and treats of surplus do not all belong to one and the same reserve army of labor. Rather, they've been constituted as surplus subworkers on the one hand and surplus care workers on the other. At times, however, the two forms of shadow work overlap, as when care work is treated as subwork and performed under the lash. And I'll return to that issue in some detail in tomorrow's lecture. In any case, it is incorrect to say, as some do now, that capitalism requires social differentiations of some kind or another, but not any specific kind, that it uses whatever it finds to hand. That's inadequate, I claim, because it misses the specificity of the system's requirements. Capitalism requires expropriated and domesticated labor as necessary conditions for the exploited labor that is widely thought to define and power it. And those two forms of shadow labor are constitutively specific. It is in one case, it is racialized as subwork, dependent toil for those who've been politically subjugated and constructed as inherently violable. In the other case, it is gendered as non-work from those who've been socially domesticated and constituted as inherently caring. The key point is that these categorizations are systemic, as are the faces of labor to which they are tied. Race and gender have structural bases in capitalist societies, as, of course, does class. And they are as deeply implanted in it as is the latter. In fact, each member of the famous triad derives its social meaning and political force from their imbrication with one another. And that includes class as well as race and gender. Its meaning, too, has been co-constituted with theirs through capitalism's system dynamics, in which all three faces of labor are imbricated and, it must be said, deformed. And that means, as I'll explain in Lecture 3, that we need to revise our conception of what we call the working class. Much more needs to be said about the processes that constitute all of this, about the various intersections of the three faces of labor, and about the forms of social struggle to which they give rise. And much more will be said about those things in the next two lectures. But I hope I've said enough today to convince you that Du Bois was onto something important in Black Reconstruction. By writing of what he called the dark proletariat and the global color line, he pointed the way to a new view of capitalist society as a society that relies on more than one face of labor and that precipitates more than one form of labor movement. That perspective has since been enriched, and I'll say complicated, by feminist analyses of gendered care work and social reproductive labor. By combining their insights with those of Du Bois, I have suggested that capitalist societies give rise, for non-accidental reasons, to a system-specific nexus of not two, but three faces of labor, analytically distinct, but functionally imbricated, internally related, and mutually co-constituted. The effect is to uncover some hidden ties among gender, race, and class in capitalist societies. It is also to deepen the conceptual force of the term intersectionality and to forward the political project I associated with it. That project, as I'm viewing it here, through a lens inspired by Du Bois but widened, involves building a counter-hegemonic political bloc that embraces the concerns of three labor movements, of feminism, anti-racism, anti-imperialism, and trade unionism, a political bloc that fosters greater integration and coordination among them. Thanks very much for your attention. I hope you'll come back for more.
Wow. So thank you so much for a fantastic and rich lecture. I can't wait to hear more tomorrow, actually. And we do have some time for the Q&A, so please queue at the aisles that are left and right at the center. Okay. Can you please dim the light so that I can see the audience? Okay. Okay, so you go first.
Ja, vielen Dank für diese sehr spannende Stunde. Ich habe eine Frage, und zwar, Sie haben, so habe ich Sie zumindest verstanden, gesagt, dass aus Menschen im Prinzip ein Wert gemacht wird, der dann ja für die Kapitalseite zum Wert gemacht wird. Erst aus Frauen oder aus Menschen und aus bestimmten Klassen. Wollen Sie, dass ich auf Englisch spreche, oder?
Wenn Sie... I'll translate for her, but I mean, as you like.
Ja, ich weiß noch nicht so ganz genau, wie ich das jetzt hier so hinkriege.
Völlig in Ordnung.
Also aus meiner Sicht haben Sie im Prinzip gesagt, dass etwas in Besitz genommen wurde und daraus wurde ein Wert gemacht. Und daraus konnte Reichtum geschaffen werden, indem man das immer wieder angehäuft hat, also zum Beispiel anhand der Sklaven. Und Sie haben aber auch gesagt, wir sollen groß denken. Und bisher haben Sie nur die menschlichen Seiten angesprochen. Wie ist es denn mit nichtmenschlichen Seiten? Also, also wir nehmen auch die Natur in Anspruch und machen aus ihr einen Wert und üben damit oder legitimieren damit Macht über diese Natur und aber auch deren Ausrottung. Und wenn wir das jetzt als Bewegung denken sollen, wie kann man das damit dann zusammendenken und wie bekommen wir das so hinzudenken und nicht nur auf dem Menschlichen stehen zu bleiben?
Okay, so the question is, you have emphasized the fact that capital puts value on human beings and turns them into capital. So you have only covered the human side of it, but what about nature? What about putting value, turning nature into capital?
Yeah, it's a great question and very important to raise it here. I'm extremely interested in the way that capital constructs and essentially depletes and destroys nature. That's a absolutely fundamental dimension, a necessary dimension of its functioning, and it has to do with the same dynamic of extracting value, extracting profit by getting things cheap, by not paying for the reproduction of the inputs, not replenishing, not repairing, just grabbing and leaving, a trail of wreckage everywhere. That's equally fundamental to capitalism, in my view. There's a chapter on this very issue in the new book, Cannibal Capitalism. Now, the question is, how exactly should that whole problematic figure into and relate to this question of labor? There are those who actually speak of the work of nature. Jason W. Moore has written a very interesting book called Capitalism and the Web of Life, which makes the case that nature works, that all of its processes of self-replenishment, reproduction, and so on, count as work, and it's work that capital rips off, precisely in the way I just said, by not paying for its reproduction. To me, this, I understand it, it's a very interesting idea, but it's a bridge too far, because I am interested in labor from the perspective of trying to think about this problem of building a counter-hegemonic movement. Ecological questions, ecological struggles have to definitely be part of this movement. But and they intersect with, I would say, the forms of labor struggles that I'm focusing on here. But not because they are, not because nature works. Somehow the connections have to be drawn in a different way. So, for example, I would make connections to the racialization side of things that I talked about here, expropriation, because in the following way, subjugated, dependent, unfree, racialized populations who are violable and subject to exploitation are living in the places that capital treats as its toxic dumps, right? When you're going to expropriate nature, you're almost always, with a few rare exceptions, expropriating somebody's neighborhood, somebody's habitat, the place where they live and the place that has meaning where they reproduce their communities. So in that sense, ecological depredation and expropriation racialized expropriation are closely connected. This is an example of how I would like to try to make some connections, and I think I will say some more about this in the final lecture, without taking the Jason Moore route of saying that nature works and is somehow a fourth face of labor.
Next one is on the left. Sorry, you're next.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. A very inspiring talk. I just have two questions. The first one that comes to mind is the distinction that used to be made in the past between peasants and workers. So I wanted to ask you about that. I was thinking about, the classical debates, Mao and Lenin and so on. And the reason it comes to mind is because when I think of your three phases of labor, maybe the position of a peasant might not fit so neatly in any category. So they're not directly exploited in the sense of a wage labor. They might not be expropriated either. And they might not be domesticated either. They might be landowners that are fairly, wealthy or not. It all depends on the case. But I wanted to ask about, have you thought about the peasant distinction in this? And that's my first question. And my second question concerns this notion of the labor aristocracy that's been coming up a little bit in recent debates. Of course, as you said, expropriation is structurally tied to exploitation. And some people might argue that it's structurally tied in this specific way, in that wages of the global north are sustained by the rents that are sought in imperial rents and so on. So in a sense that there might be a tension or a contradiction, quote unquote, between the wages of the global north, which are like lubricated by the intense super exploitation of the global south. I just wanted to see if you have some comments on that. Thank you.
Okay. Great, thank you. Two very interesting and important questions. Peasants, you're right to say sort of on their face, aren't always expropriated or exploited. But this is something I'll get to tomorrow and in the last lecture. There are forms of expropriation at work that work through debt, through colonial tribute extraction under direct rule colonialism, through neo-imperial wealth drain, unequal exchange, and all the rest in post-colonial imperialism. So I want to sort of include them in that expropriated category. Of course, there might be wealthy peasants, just as there are, highly paid professional workers. Right, that doesn't contradict the sort of idea of these three categories. What interests me about, you raised the question about peasants and workers, that's a beautiful example of this problem of creating a counter-hegemonic bloc. I mean, Lenin famously, whatever else we say about him, understood that he had to create some kind of a bloc among two different kinds of workers. Party, all right, whatever. I'm not going to go there. But and so that's a sort of a sketch here of kind of what the problem is. The idea of imbrication of different forms of labor, neither of whom is able to change the system on its own. Okay, as to the so-called labor aristocracy, this too is something I will talk about in the third lecture. And here, just to give you a little foretaste, here I want to rely again on Du Bois, who famously talked about whiteness as a psychological wage, meaning that in a racist society, white workers, I would never use the phrase labor aristocracy, actually, to describe people who are today devastated by opioid addiction and suicide and God knows what else. It's not a good word to use aristocracy, but let's see, what was I saying? Yeah, but for Du Bois's idea was they gained something, but it's pretty damn little and pretty paltry. It's a compensatory self-esteem, so to speak, for the idea is they have much more to gain than to lose through an alliance. That doesn't mean they recognize it all the time or even often, although maybe there are some conditions under which they do. But in any case, the whole point of trying to analyze these capitalism in terms of these three faces of labor is to show how divisions are built into the system. They are not accidental, these divisions. It's not that people just get bad ideas in their head about other people. There's an actual, not just deliberately cultivated division, although that exists as well, but there's an actual structural basis for it. And so it requires serious political work in order to, quote unquote, uncover those hidden ties and let people see who their real enemies are, and not the ones that the system has constructed for them as enemies.
Okay, so we're just alternating between the two mics. I have difficulty seeing the cue. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. First and foremost, thank you so much for what seems to be like a potentially very productive way of looking at it. I just want, before jumping on ship, I'm wondering what, if anything, do you think might be lost by looking at it through a post-intersectional, or like through a post-intersectional lens at these movements?
Good.
And I mean, just to, so, yeah, I mean, is there, I wonder, I mean, I wrote it down to be able to be concise, so is there something to be said about a recognition of different ways of being in the world in these movements? Or is it really all just about how we labor? And I wonder what would people like James Baldwin, Bell Hooks, or perhaps Hannah Arendt say about the argument you expounded upon? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, as I'm working through these ideas, I'm constantly posing these questions to myself. What is lost? It's a question I pose to myself, and one that I am going to take up explicitly in the third lecture. You might think that by focusing on the labor dimension of gender, race, and class, by singling that the labor side as the sort of the structural, the constitutive, foundation of these divisions in capitalist society, that one is engaged in a kind of reductionism, that it therefore turns out that all the other things that people fight against when it comes to racism that on their face don't have much to do with labor, or when they fight against sexism or heterosexism or transphobia or whatever, that all of that gets lost. And what I want to say, my answer is that, well, it's a two-part answer. One part is that in many, though perhaps not all cases, it is actually possible to show how issues that on their face don't seem to have a lot to do with labor actually connect up with it. That's part one of the answer. part two of the answer is that even where they don't directly connect up with labor, the labor lens discloses a structural picture about connection and about division that is politically helpful, and that I don't think it requires people to become kind of labor reductionist. It invites a broad structural understanding of society that helps one identify their real enemies and their potential allies. But it's not saying that only labor counts. That's my idea. And as to different ways of being, I mean, here I think we get to a difference between the racialized dynamic associated with expropriation and the gendered dynamic associated with what I call domestication. Because I think that we would say that insofar as expropriated labor is constructed as, mindless, degraded toil, it's not a way of being that we want to preserve, which is not to say that there aren't all sorts of forms that people create to survive and to persist as they do it that might have definitely be worth preserving. On the other hand, here's the difference. Domesticated labor seems to me, although it's very twisted and deformed within capitalism by virtue of this hyper-affective quality it acquires, and by virtue of its segregation, its kind of apartheid status, nevertheless, this is, right, there's a kernel of something really important, and I would say that what we want to do there is to revalue it, not to abolish it, and reorganize it in a different way. So there are two different thoughts that go in different directions about what we mean by different ways of being. In any case, last point, I did not take Du Bois when he talked about two labor movements cooperating. I don't think he was after a merger. I don't think he was after a thing where now we're all just workers and the differences don't matter. And when I talk about creating a counter-hegemonic bloc embracing three labor movements, I don't mean that now we're all just workers and the differences don't matter. I'm thinking of a kind of connection that involves, let's say, differentiation within alliance as opposed to homogenizing universality.
So we have time for one, maybe two more questions, and please be patient if you don't get to ask your question. We have 2 more days, so you go.
Yes, thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I was wondering if you could maybe emphasize a bit on the point how capital is accumulated, because especially nowadays, the manner of accumulation plays a major role by speculation virtually. And I think, or we imagine that this point might be important to address, to know what we fight against.
Yeah, thanks. Good question. So, I mean, part of let me just preface this by saying that, the standard view within traditional Marxism is that capital accumulates by exploitation, by paying doubly free waged workers only for their necessary time while appropriating surplus value. That might be a technically good definition of what surplus value is, but it doesn't tell the whole story about what profit is. Profit comes not only from exploitation, but from cheap inputs whose reproduction costs are not paid, including, going back to the first question, natural inputs, right? Gouging the earth and not assuming any obligation to replenish or repair for its reproduction. Expropriation is about another kind of free riding, sloughing off reproduction costs. Domesticated labor is the same. All of that feeds into profit. Whether you call it, again, technically, if you accept a certain definition of what surplus value is, that's not surplus value. But frankly, I think profit may be even more important. It is, after all, what capitalists care about. Most of them have never even heard of surplus value, and they will profit through these cheap inputs that they acquire below cost. What you call speculation, financialization, is very closely connected to that sort of thing. It's a form of expropriation through debt, wealth drain. We could talk about the subprime mortgages that who sparked the whole 2007-08 near financial crash. In fact, that idea of subprime mortgage was where I got the idea of subwork from, because it is another sort of racialized form of debt. In any case, speculation doesn't create anything at all, but it does redistribute. And we are facing a kind of massive revival of expropriation through speculation or through debt or through financialization today. And I will be talking about that in a later lecture.
Okay, so one maybe short question, and then we're going to stop.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what do you think about Stuart Hall and his idea of race being a modality through which the class is lived or experienced?
Well, it's a very striking turn of phrase, and I like it. It's very suggestive. Look, everything depends on what we mean by class, and you might have noticed that that's a huge question. The title of my last lecture, Class Beyond Class, is that what it is? Yeah, Class Beyond Class. I mean, that's like for those who follow these arcane things, that's a sort of play on Tony Negri's Marx Beyond Marx. So the idea is that there's another sense of class waiting for us at the end of this story that's going to show us how problematic our received idea of class is. And I'm not sure if that's what Stuart Hall was getting at or not, but he was certainly positing some kind of very close connection between race and class. As am I. You can, it's clear that we can define what we mean by the global working class as Du Bois's dark proletariat plus smaller, lighter proletariat plus, I don't know what word to use, plus the domesticated proletariat, if one could speak that way. That would all be the working class, given the very broad definition of labor that I started out with. But again, They're not all the same. The system constructs them differently, and therefore it creates a problem for those who want to create the class for itself, because all those divisions are real and materially grounded.
So thank you so much again for a wonderful lecture, for a wonderful start for this series of lectures. Thank you all for being here. So looking forward to seeing all of you tomorrow, and I want to add a special thanks to the interpreters who have done wonderful work, I think stressful, I hope not exploited work, and the technicians of this wonderful house. See you tomorrow. Have a safe trip home, and please remember those road closures will persist over the next 2 days, so plan accordingly and get home safely. Thank you. So.